The grand ballroom fell silent as tiny, dirt-stained fingers reached toward the pristine white piano keys. 8-year-old Ethan had nothing left to lose, but everything to prove. But no one imagined what would come next. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The Meridian Hotel's grand ballroom sparkled like a jewelry box under the weight of 1,000 crystal chandeliers. Manhattan's elite had gathered for Alexander Sterling's annual charity gala, their designer gowns and perfectly tailored tuxedos creating a sea of wealth and privilege that stretched across the marble floor. At 32, Alexander commanded the room with an effortless authority that came from building a tech empire worth $12 billion before most people finish graduate school. He stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, his piercing blue eyes scanning the crowd with the calculated precision that had made him legendary on Wall Street. His black Tom Ford tuxedo fit him like armor, every detail meticulously crafted to project the image of untouchable success. A Patek Philippe watch gleamed at his wrist, not ostentatious, just perfect, like everything else in his carefully curated world. "Alexander, darling, you've outdone yourself this year," purred Margaret Ashford, the 70-year-old socialite whose family had owned half of Manhattan for 3 generations. Her emerald necklace caught the light as she gestured toward the ice sculptures shaped like musical notes. A symphony-themed gala for the Children's Music Foundation. How wonderfully poetic. Alexander's smile was polished chrome, warm on the surface but cold underneath. Music has the power to transform lives, Margaret. Tonight, we're not just raising money, we're investing in miracles. The words rolled off his tongue with practiced ease, but something felt hollow about them tonight. He'd been feeling that way a lot lately, as if success had become a beautiful cage that kept him separate from anything real or meaningful. The conversations were always the same, the faces interchangeable, the problems solved with the stroke of a checkbook. "Mr. Sterling, the auction items are generating tremendous interest," his assistant Sarah approached with her tablet, efficient as always in her midnight blue gown. "The Steinway Baby Grand has already reached 300,000 in preliminary bids." "Excellent," Alexander nodded, though his attention drifted to the massive concert grand piano positioned at the center of the ballroom. It was a magnificent Bösendorfer Imperial, its ebony surface so perfectly polished it reflected the chandelier lights like a dark mirror. Later tonight, world-renowned pianist Marcus Chen would perform a specially commissioned piece. But for now, it stood silent and waiting, almost expectant. The heavy oak doors at the ballroom's entrance swung open with a soft whoosh, and the uniformed security guard stepped through with his usual professional bearing. But tonight, something was different. Behind him, moving with the hesitant steps of someone who didn't belong, was a small figure that made Alexander's breath catch in his throat. The boy couldn't have been more than 8 years old, his thin frame swimming in clothes that had seen better years. His jeans were torn at both knees, his sneakers held together with what looked like electrical tape, and his oversized hoodie bore stains that told stories of sleeping rough and scrounging for meals. But it was his face that struck Alexander most. Beneath the layer of street grime was a bone structure that spoke of good genetics, intelligent hazel eyes that seemed far older than his years, and an expression of determined dignity that no amount of hardship had been able to break. The security guard's hand rested firmly on the boy's shoulder, not harsh, but clearly guiding him toward a swift exit. "I'm sorry, Mr. Sterling." He slipped past the front desk somehow. "I'll escort him out immediately." But the boy stepped forward with a courage that silenced the nearby conversations, his small chin lifted with pride despite his obvious desperation. When he spoke, his voice carried the slight rasp of someone who'd spent too many nights in the cold, but his words were clear and articulate. "Please, sir," he addressed Alexander directly, ignoring the shocked whispers that began to ripple through the crowd. "I don't want money or anything like that. I haven't eaten in 2 days, and I saw all the fancy food through the windows. If I play something on your piano, something beautiful, would you let me have just a little something to eat?" The request hung in the air like a discordant note, completely at odds with the evening's careful orchestration. Around them, the city's most powerful people began to take notice, their conversations trailing off as they turned to witness this unprecedented breach of their insulated world. Lady Patricia Huntington, whose family traced their lineage back to British royalty, let out a laugh that tinkled like breaking glass. How perfectly precious! Did someone hire a street performer for entertainment? Though I must say, the authenticity is remarkable. He actually looks genuinely hungry. More laughter joined hers, cruel and dismissive, as if the boys' desperation was nothing more than an amusing diversion from their champagne and caviar. Alexander felt something twist uncomfortably in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, shame, hot and immediate, at being associated with such callousness. The boy's face flushed red, but he didn't back down. Instead, he squared his narrow shoulders and looked Alexander directly in the eye. "I know I don't look like I belong here, sir, but I can play. I taught myself. I've been playing in the subway stations and people stop to listen. I'm good, I promise. Just give me a chance." "Security!" boomed Richard Blackstone, a real estate mogul whose personality was as abrasive as his business practices. "This is preposterous. We're trying to have a civilized evening, not run a soup kitchen." But Alexander found himself studying the boy more closely. Something about his earnestness cutting through the noise of the crowd's disdain. There was something in those hazel eyes, a flicker of desperate hope mixed with steely determination that reminded him of himself, actually. A long time ago, when he'd been fighting his own battles against impossible odds. "What's your name, son?" Alexander asked quietly, his voice carrying enough authority to hush the nearby chatter. "Ethan," the boy replied, his hands unconsciously wiping against his jeans, as if trying to clean them for this moment. "Ethan Clark." The surname hit Alexander like a physical blow, though he couldn't quite place why. Something about it felt significant, familiar in a way that made his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't identify. He found himself taking a step closer, studying the boy's features with new intensity. "And you taught yourself to play piano, Ethan?" "Yes, sir. There's an old broken piano in the subway station at Times Square. The keys still work, mostly. I've been practicing there for—" Ethan paused, seeming to calculate. 2 years now, ever since He caught himself, unwilling to reveal more of his story to this crowd of strangers. Margaret Ashford's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Alexander, surely you're not seriously considering allowing this child to touch that priceless instrument? The insurance alone—" "The insurance is my concern, Margaret," Alexander replied coolly, never taking his eyes off Ethan. Something was happening here, something he didn't fully understand but couldn't ignore. "Tell me, Ethan, what would you play for us?" The boy's face lit up with the first genuine smile Alexander had seen all evening. "Clair de Lune, sir, by Debussy. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever heard, and I've been working on it for months. I can play it perfectly now, I swear." The choice struck Alexander as remarkably sophisticated for a child who taught himself on a broken subway piano. Debussy's masterpiece was technically demanding and emotionally complex, not exactly the simple tune one might expect from a street urchin looking for a meal. Dr. Harrison Wells, a prominent psychiatrist and amateur classical music enthusiast, scoffed loudly. "Ridiculous! Clair de Lune requires years of formal training and mature understanding of emotional nuance. This child couldn't possibly—" "Let him try," Alexander heard himself say, the words surprising him as much as everyone else. The room fell dead silent, 200 pairs of eyes turning to stare at him, with expressions ranging from shock to disapproval to fascination. Sarah leaned close, her voice urgent and low. "Sir, perhaps we should consider the implications." But Alexander was already walking toward the piano, his decision made by some instinct he didn't fully understand. "Clear a path," he said simply, and the crowd parted like water, their whispers creating a susurrus of anticipation and disbelief. Ethan followed him with quick, nervous steps, his eyes wide with wonder as he approached the magnificent instrument. Up close, the Bösendorfer seemed almost mythical in its perfection, its ebony surface reflecting their faces like a dark pool of possibility. "Have you ever seen a piano like this before?" Alexander asked softly. "No, sir," Ethan whispered, his voice filled with reverence. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. May I?" He reached out tentatively, then pulled his hand back, suddenly aware of how dirty his fingers must look against such pristine perfection. Alexander felt that twist in his chest again, sharper this time. Without a word, he pulled out his handkerchief, Italian silk monogrammed with his initials, and handed it to the boy. "Clean your hands first. A piano this fine deserves respect." Ethan took the handkerchief with trembling fingers, carefully wiping each digit with the solemnity of a religious ritual. When he was finished, he looked up at Alexander, with eyes bright with unshed tears. "Thank you, sir. I'll make it beautiful, I promise." As Ethan climbed onto the piano bench, adjusting it with practiced movements that spoke of real familiarity with the instrument, Alexander found himself holding his breath. The entire ballroom had gone silent, 200 of the world's most powerful people waiting to witness what would either be a moment of unexpected beauty or a humiliating disaster. But there was something about the way Ethan positioned his small hands over the keys, the way his back straightened and his breathing deepened, that made Alexander suspect they were about to experience something extraordinary. The boy closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, they held a focus and intensity that seemed to transform his entire being. His dirty, torn clothes suddenly seemed irrelevant. His unwashed hair and grimy face faded into background details. All that mattered were those small hands, poised above the keys with the confidence of someone who had found their true calling. And then Ethan began to play. The first notes of Clair de Lune floated through the ballroom like liquid moonlight, each phrase more perfect than the last. Ethan's technique wasn't just competent, it was extraordinary, displaying a level of musical maturity that defied his age and circumstances. His small hands moved across the keys with an almost supernatural grace, coaxing from the Bösendorfer a sound so pure and emotionally resonant that it seemed to transform the very air around them. Alexander stood transfixed, watching this impossible child channel Debussy's masterpiece with an interpretation that would have impressed conservatory graduates. The delicate opening measures cascaded through the room, silencing every whisper, every breath, until nothing existed except the music and the small figure creating it. But for Ethan, the ballroom and its glittering occupants had ceased to exist. As his fingers found their rhythm on the perfect keys, his mind drifted backward through time, to a much darker place where music had been both his salvation and his escape. 2 years earlier, the Riverside Children's Home squatted like a grey wound against the industrial landscape of Queens, its brick facade stained with decades of neglect and broken promises. Inside, the walls echoed with the sound of children who had learned too early that hope was a luxury they couldn't afford. 6-year-old Ethan huddled in the corner of the common room, his back pressed against the cold radiator as he watched the older boys play their cruel games. His stomach ached with familiar hunger. Dinner had been watery soup and a slice of bread, barely enough to sustain a growing child, but Mrs. Henley, the director, insisted they should be grateful for whatever charity provides. "Hey, Clark!" Tommy Brennan's voice cut through the room like a whip crack. At 12, Tommy ruled the home through intimidation and violence, his fists settling disputes that the overwhelmed staff either couldn't or wouldn't address. "Still pretending your mama's coming back for you?" Ethan's hands clenched into small fists, but he knew better than to respond. The last time he'd talked back, Tommy had given him a black eye that took weeks to heal, and when Mrs. Henley asked about it, Tommy had claimed Ethan fell down the stairs. She'd believed him, of course. She always believed Tommy. "My mom said your mother was a junkie whore who died in an alley," Tommy continued, his cronies laughing at his crude words. "Said she probably didn't even know who your daddy was. That's why nobody wants you. You're defective goods." The words hit Ethan like physical blows, not because they were unexpected, but because part of him feared they might be true. He had no memories of his mother beyond the fever dreams of a 4-year-old, just fragments of a woman's voice singing softly in the darkness, gentle hands smoothing his hair when nightmares woke him screaming. "Leave him alone, Tommy." The voice came from Sarah Chen, a 10-year-old girl who'd arrived at Riverside 3 months ago after her grandmother died. Unlike most of the children, who learned quickly to keep their heads down and survive, Sarah had retained a fierce sense of justice that often got her into trouble. Tommy's face darkened with rage. "Nobody asked you, chink." "Don't call me that," Sarah snapped, stepping protectively in front of Ethan. Her small frame was trembling, but her voice never wavered. "And don't pick on little kids. Pick on someone your own size." "You mean like you?" Tommy's laugh was ugly and threatening. "Fine. You want to protect the freak, you can suffer with him." What followed was swift and brutal. Tommy's fist caught Sarah in the stomach, doubling her over, while his friends grabbed Ethan's arms and dragged him toward the supply closet. They shoved him inside the cramped, dark space and wedged a chair under the handle, trapping him in blackness that reeked of cleaning chemicals and mouse droppings. "Maybe a few hours in there will teach you to keep your mouth shut," Tommy called through the door, "and teach your girlfriend not to stick her nose where it doesn't belong." Ethan pounded on the door until his knuckles bled, screaming for help that never came. The staff was either absent or deliberately ignoring the commotion. It was easier than dealing with the underlying problems that created it. Hours crawled by in the suffocating darkness, punctuated only by Ethan's sobs and the scurrying of unseen creatures sharing his prison. When they finally released him, it was nearly midnight. The common room was empty except for Sarah, who sat waiting with a bag of ice pressed against her bruised ribs and a fierce determination in her dark eyes. "I'm sorry," Ethan whispered, shame burning in his throat. "I'm sorry you got hurt because of me." "It's not your fault," Sarah replied firmly. "Tommy's a coward and a bully, and someday someone's going to teach him what that feels like." She helped him to his feet, and together they crept through the darkened corridors toward the dormitory. But as they passed the director's office, they heard something that made them both freeze. Music, soft and beautiful, drifting through the partially open door. Mrs. Henley sat at an old upright piano, her fingers moving over the keys with surprising grace. The harsh lines of her face had softened in the lamplight, and for a moment she looked almost human as she played a melody that seemed to speak of dreams and possibilities and all the things that felt impossibly distant from their grey world. Ethan had never heard anything so beautiful. The music seemed to reach inside his chest and touch something he didn't know existed, awakening a hunger that had nothing to do with food. Without thinking, he stepped closer, pressing his face against the gap in the door to see better. The movement caught Mrs. Henley's attention, and her hands stilled on the keys. When she turned, her face had already hardened back into its familiar mask of irritation and authority. "What are you children doing out of bed?" she snapped, rising from the piano bench with the sharp efficiency that characterized all her movements. I was just... Ethan began, but she cut him off with a dismissive wave. Back to the dormitory immediately. And if I catch you wandering the halls again, you'll spend tomorrow scrubbing floors instead of attending classes. As they hurried away, Ethan looked back once more at the piano, memorizing every detail of its scarred wooden case and yellowed keys. Something had been born in that moment of stolen music, a yearning so powerful it made his chest ache. Over the following weeks, he began sneaking back to the director's office whenever he could manage it undetected. Most nights she played, never the same piece twice, always something that spoke of beauty and complexity, far removed from their harsh daily reality. Ethan would crouch in the hallway, absorbing every note, every phrase, until the music became part of his DNA. He started to notice patterns in the melodies, relationships between the notes that seemed to follow some invisible logic. His fingers would move unconsciously, mimicking the motions he'd observed, until he could play entire pieces in his imagination with startling accuracy. The hunger grew stronger every day. 3 months later, everything changed. Mrs. Henley announced that budget cuts would force the closure of several programs, including the music therapy sessions that had been one of the few bright spots in their week. The old piano would be donated to another facility, she explained with characteristic indifference, as if she were discussing the disposal of broken furniture rather than the destruction of dreams. That night, Ethan made a decision that would alter the course of his life forever. He waited until the building settled into its usual restless sleep, then crept through the darkened corridors toward the office. The piano sat in the corner like a faithful friend, awaiting one final goodbye. With trembling hands, he lifted the keyboard cover and placed his small fingers on the keys. The first chord rang out soft and pure, a perfect major triad that seemed to fill the empty space with possibility. Ethan's heart hammered against his ribs as he attempted his first real piece, a simple children's song he remembered from somewhere deep in his fractured past. His technique was clumsy, his timing uncertain, but the connection was immediate and electric. Each note felt like coming home to a place he'd never been, but always belonged. For the first time in his short, difficult life, Ethan felt complete. He played for over an hour, losing himself in melodies both remembered and improvised, his confidence growing with every passing minute. By the time he finally crept back to his bed, he knew with absolute certainty that music would be his path to freedom. The next morning brought catastrophe. Tommy Brennan had seen him returning from his midnight adventure and wasted no time reporting the transgression to Mrs. Henley. Her rage was volcanic and immediate, her accusations of theft and destruction echoing through the building like thunder. "You have violated the most basic trust," she screamed, her face purple with fury. "This piano is worth more than you'll ever see in your pathetic life, and you dared to put your grubby hands on it." The punishment was swift and merciless. 2 weeks in solitary confinement, meals reduced to bread and water, and a formal notation in his file that would make him effectively unadoptable. But worse than any physical consequence was being permanently banned from the music room, cut off from the only thing that had ever made him feel alive. That night, as he lay in the punishment cell's narrow cot, Ethan made another decision that would define his future. He was going to escape. The plan took 2 months to develop and execute. He studied the staff schedules, mapped the building's security weaknesses, and slowly accumulated supplies: a small backpack, warm clothes stolen from the lost and found, and the $17 he'd managed to collect from returned soda bottles. On a cold February morning, while the staff was distracted by a fight in the dining hall, Ethan slipped out through a basement window and disappeared into the maze of Queens' industrial streets. He was 7 years old, alone, and completely unprepared for life on his own. But he was free. The streets of New York City embraced Ethan with the brutal indifference that defined urban survival. Those first weeks of freedom were a harsh education in realities no 7-year-old should have to learn. Where to find shelter from the wind, which dumpsters might yield edible scraps, how to recognize the predators who saw vulnerability as opportunity. But it was in the subway tunnels that Ethan discovered his salvation. The Times Square station hummed with constant activity, thousands of commuters flowing through its corridors like blood through arteries. In a forgotten corner near the downtown platform, someone had abandoned an old upright piano, its wood case scarred and several keys permanently silenced, but its remaining voices still capable of producing music. The first time Ethan approached it, his hands shaking with cold and hunger, a transit cop had chased him away with threats about vagrancy and loitering. But he kept returning, drawn by a compulsion stronger than fear or common sense. Eventually, the officers grew accustomed to the small figure hunched over the broken keys, and as long as he didn't cause trouble or block foot traffic, they let him be. The piano became his teacher, his companion, his reason for waking up each morning in whatever doorway or steam grate had sheltered him through the night. Despite missing keys and being perpetually out of tune, it was capable of magic in the right hands, and Ethan's hands, it turned out, were very right indeed. He taught himself through experimentation and obsessive practice, spending 12 to 14 hours a day coaxing music from the damaged instrument. His repertoire grew from simple melodies to complex compositions, his technique evolving from clumsy enthusiasm to genuine artistry. The broken piano's limitations forced him to be creative, to find ways of expressing complete musical ideas despite missing notes and mechanical failures. Within 6 months, commuters began stopping to listen. At first, it was just curious glances and brief pauses, but as Ethan's skill developed, people started gathering around the piano, their rushed morning routines temporarily forgotten in the face of unexpected beauty. The tips started small, loose change dropped into his open backpack, occasionally a dollar bill from someone particularly moved by his performance. But as word spread through the underground network of subway regulars, the crowds grew larger and the donations more substantial. "That kid's something special," he overheard a woman tell her friend one morning. "I heard him play Rachmaninoff yesterday, and I swear I started crying right there on the platform." Ethan had never heard of Rachmaninoff, but he filed the name away for future exploration. Every piece of musical knowledge was precious, gathered from overheard conversations, discarded sheet music found in trash cans, or fragments of classical radio broadcasts that drifted from shops and restaurants. His breakthrough came on a particularly cold December morning during his 8th year. He'd been living on the streets for almost 2 years by then, having grown from a terrified child into a streetwise survivor who could navigate the city's dangers with the instincts of someone twice his age. That morning, he decided to attempt something ambitious, Debussy's Clair de Lune, a piece he'd heard only once on a construction worker's radio, but which had haunted his dreams for weeks. The melody was ethereally beautiful, technically demanding, and emotionally complex in ways that seemed to require life experiences far beyond his years. But as his fingers found the opening notes on the damaged keys, something extraordinary happened. The missing notes didn't matter anymore. He played around them, finding alternative voicings and harmonies that preserved the piece's essential character while accommodating the piano's limitations. His interpretation was unique, shaped by hardship and longing in ways that no conservatory training could have replicated. The effect on his audience was immediate and electric. The usual morning crowd of harried commuters slowed, then stopped entirely, drawn by music that seemed to transform the grimy subway station into a concert hall. Business executives in $1,000 suits stood mesmerized alongside homeless veterans and teenage runaways, all united in their recognition that they were witnessing something genuinely special. When the final notes faded, the silence stretched for several heartbeats before erupting into spontaneous applause. Bills rained into his backpack. Fives, tens, even a few twenties, from listeners who understood they'd experienced something precious and rare. But more important than the money was the validation. For the first time since his escape from Riverside, Ethan felt truly seen and valued for who he was, rather than pitied for what he lacked. Music had given him not just survival, but purpose. Back in the Meridian Hotel's ballroom, that same transformative power was working its magic on an audience that had never imagined such artistry could emerge from such unlikely circumstances. Alexander Sterling stood transfixed as Ethan's interpretation of Claire de Lune unfolded with a complexity and emotional depth that rivaled professional recordings. The boy's technique was flawless, his musical understanding profound, but it was the story embedded in every phrase, the loneliness, the resilience, the desperate hope, that elevated his performance from mere entertainment to genuine art. Each note seemed to carry the weight of his young life, the piano singing with voices that spoke of cold nights and empty stomachs, and the unshakable belief that beauty could exist even in the darkest places. Margaret Ashford's champagne glass had stopped halfway to her lips, her carefully composed social mask slipping to reveal something approaching wonder. Dr. Wells stood frozen mid-conversation, his earlier dismissiveness evaporating as he recognized the sophistication of Ethan's interpretation. Even Tommy Richardson, whose cynicism was legendary among the city's elite, found himself leaning forward with an expression of grudging respect. But it was Alexander who felt the music most deeply, each phrase resonating with memories he'd spent years trying to suppress. There was something in Ethan's playing that reached past his carefully constructed defenses and touched the part of him that remembered being young and vulnerable and desperate to prove his worth to a world that seemed determined to dismiss him. As the piece moved toward its climactic section, Alexander studied the boy's face with growing intensity. There was something familiar about his features, something that nagged at the edges of recognition without quite breaking through into conscious memory. The shape of his jawline, perhaps, or the way his eyebrows drew together in concentration. The thought was interrupted by a commotion at the ballroom's entrance. Sarah materialized at Alexander's elbow, her expression urgent and confused. "Sir, there's someone here asking about the boy," she whispered. "Says she's from the Department of Child Services. Apparently, someone called in a report about an unaccompanied minor." Alexander's blood ran cold. His eyes snapped to the entrance, where a severe-looking woman in a bureaucratic suit was speaking with security, her gaze already scanning the room with predatory efficiency. "Not now," he said quietly, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. "Whatever needs to be discussed can wait until after his performance." But even as he spoke, Alexander knew that time was running out. Whatever was happening here, this moment of impossible beauty created by an extraordinary child who'd appeared from nowhere, was fragile and precious and about to be destroyed by the grinding machinery of institutional authority. Ethan's fingers moved through the piece's final passages with increasing intensity, as if he somehow sensed the approaching danger. The music swelled toward its conclusion, each note crystal clear and perfectly placed, building toward a resolution that would either cement his triumph or serve as his farewell. In the breathless silence that followed the final chord, 200 pairs of eyes stared at the small figure seated at the magnificent piano, and Alexander Sterling realized that his carefully ordered world was about to change in ways he couldn't possibly have imagined. The thunderous applause that erupted in the wake of Ethan's performance was unlike anything the Meridian Hotel's ballroom had ever witnessed. 200 of Manhattan's most jaded elite found themselves on their feet, their usual reserve shattered by the raw emotional power of what they'd just experienced. Tears streamed down faces that were accustomed to maintaining perfect composure, and hardened business moguls wiped their eyes with $1,000 handkerchiefs. Alexander Sterling stood frozen in place, his rational mind struggling to process what he'd witnessed. The child's technique had been flawless, but it was more than that. There had been something in Ethan's interpretation that spoke of pain and resilience and hope that seemed impossible for someone so young to possess, let alone express with such sophistication. Magnificent, Doctor. Harrison Wells gasped, his earlier skepticism completely evaporated. I've heard Marcus Chen perform that piece at Carnegie Hall, and this child understood something that eluded a master. Where on earth did you learn to play like that? Ethan slowly lifted his hands from the keys, his small frame trembling with exhaustion and emotion. The transition from his musical trance back to reality was jarring, like surfacing from deep water into harsh sunlight. The faces surrounding him seemed surreal after the intimate communion he'd shared with the instrument. I taught myself, he whispered, his voice hoarse with spent emotion, in the subway. There's a broken piano there, and I practiced every day for. Ma'am, I need you to step aside. The stern voice cut through the celebration like a blade through silk. Alexander turned to see the woman from Child Protective Services pushing through the crowd with bureaucratic determination, her clipboard clutched like a weapon and her expression radiating the kind of institutional authority that brooked no argument. I'm Janet Morrison from the Department of Children and Family Services, she announced, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet ballroom. I'm here about an unaccompanied minor who was reported at this location. You must be the child in question. She fixed Ethan with a stare that was clinical in its assessment, taking in his torn clothing, unwashed hair, and obvious signs of street life with the practiced eye of someone who had seen too many such cases. Son, I need you to come with me immediately. We have procedures for situations like this. Wait. Alexander's voice rang out with commanding authority, stopping Ms. Morrison mid-stride. Every eye in the room turned to him as he stepped forward, placing himself between the social worker and Ethan with the protective instinct of a parent. I think there may be some confusion here. Ms. Morrison's expression hardened with professional suspicion. Sir, I don't know who you are, but this child is clearly living on the streets without proper supervision. My job is to ensure his safety and welfare, and that means removing him from this situation immediately. My name is Alexander Sterling, he replied coolly, allowing the weight of his reputation to settle over the room like a blanket. This is my event in my hotel, and I can assure you that Ethan is perfectly safe here. Mr. Sterling, I'm familiar with your name and your influence, Ms. Morrison said, her tone suggesting that wealth and power meant nothing to her, but influence doesn't change child welfare law. This boy is obviously homeless, malnourished, and in need of proper care. I have a legal obligation to... You have a legal obligation to ensure his well-being, Alexander interrupted, his voice taking on the razor-sharp edge that had intimidated boardrooms full of seasoned executives. But removing him from a safe environment where he's clearly thriving doesn't serve that purpose. As he spoke, Alexander found his gaze drawn repeatedly to Ethan's face, studying the features that seemed increasingly familiar with each passing moment. There was something about the shape of his eyes, the line of his jaw, even the way he held himself despite his obvious fear that triggered memories Alexander couldn't quite access. Mr. Sterling, Sarah appeared at his elbow, her voice urgent and low. Perhaps we should continue this conversation in private? The guests are becoming concerned. Indeed, the ballroom's atmosphere had shifted from celebration to tension as Manhattan's elite found themselves witnessing a confrontation between power and bureaucracy. Phones were beginning to emerge from designer purses and tuxedo pockets, social media posts and news alerts spreading outward from the epicenter of drama. Ethan, Alexander said gently, crouching down to meet the boy at eye level. I want you to know that you're safe here. No one is going to hurt you or take you anywhere you don't want to go. Do you understand me?" The child nodded mutely, but his hazel eyes were wide with the kind of terror that came from too many experiences with authority figures who promised safety but delivered betrayal. His small hands gripped the piano bench as if it were an anchor in a storm-tossed sea. "Sir," Ms. Morrison's voice had taken on an edge of real annoyance. "I appreciate your concern, but you're interfering with official business. This child needs proper medical evaluation, psychological assessment, and placement in an appropriate facility until we can determine what he needs," Alexander said, rising to his full height and fixing the social worker with a stare that had made billionaire competitors reconsider their strategies. "Is someone who recognizes his extraordinary gifts and helps him develop them, not another institutional environment that will crush his spirit and waste his potential." The words surprised him with their intensity, emerging from some deep well of emotion he hadn't known existed. But as he looked down at Ethan, this remarkable child who had somehow found beauty and meaning in circumstances that would have broken most adults, Alexander felt something shift fundamentally inside his chest. Margaret Ashford stepped forward, her usual social artifice replaced by genuine concern. "Alexander, darling, surely you're not suggesting that a child living on the streets is better off than in proper care? I mean, one must consider the practical realities." "The practical reality," Alexander replied, without taking his eyes off Ethan, "is that this child has accomplished something remarkable despite every disadvantage society could throw at him. He's taught himself to play piano at a professional level, survived on his own for 2 years, and maintained his dignity and humanity through circumstances that would have destroyed lesser people. That doesn't sound like someone who needs fixing. That sounds like someone who needs supporting." "Doctor." Wells nodded thoughtfully, his psychiatric training recognizing something significant in the dynamics playing out before them. "The boy does display remarkable resilience and capability. Perhaps a more gradual approach would be appropriate?" But Ms. Morrison was unmoved by appeals to Ethan's artistic abilities or psychological strength. "Gentlemen, ladies, I understand your concerns, but the law is clear. An unaccompanied minor living on the streets must be taken into protective custody pending investigation. His talents are irrelevant to his immediate safety needs." She reached into her briefcase and withdrew an official-looking document. "I have temporary custody orders that give me the authority to remove him right now. Security, I'll need your assistance." "Actually, you won't." The new voice belonged to David Chen, Alexander's personal attorney, who had materialized seemingly from nowhere with the silent efficiency that made him worth his 7-figure retainer. Immaculately dressed and carrying a leather portfolio that probably cost more than most people's cars, he radiated the kind of legal authority that made government bureaucrats reconsider their positions. "David," Alexander said with obvious relief, "I wasn't expecting you tonight." "Sarah called me 20 minutes ago," the lawyer replied smoothly. "She thought you might need legal counsel, and given the unique circumstances, I thought it prudent to attend personally." He turned to Ms. Morrison with a smile that was polite, but sharp as a blade. "Ms. Morrison, I'm David Chen, Mr. Sterling's legal counsel. I've taken the liberty of reviewing the relevant statutes, and I believe there may be some procedural issues with your proposed actions." Ms. Morrison's confident expression flickered slightly. "What kind of procedural issues?" "Well, for starters, your temporary custody order was issued based on a complaint about an abandoned child. But as I understand it, this young man approached Mr. Sterling voluntarily and has been under his direct supervision since arriving at the hotel. That doesn't constitute abandonment under New York family court precedent." David opened his portfolio and withdrew several documents with the theatrical flair that had made him legendary in courtrooms across the city. Furthermore, any removal action would require a hearing before a family court judge, and given that it's currently. He checked his Rolex with exaggerated precision. Nearly 11 p.m. on a Saturday evening. I doubt you'll find a judge willing to sign emergency orders without compelling evidence of immediate danger. This child is homeless, Miss Morrison protested, her bureaucratic certainty beginning to crack under legal scrutiny. Tonight, this child is a guest at a private event hosted by one of the city's most respected philanthropists, David replied mildly. Tomorrow, we can certainly discuss appropriate long-term arrangements through proper legal channels. But tonight he's safe, fed, and surrounded by people who are demonstrating genuine concern for his welfare. Alexander watched this legal chess match with growing admiration for his attorney's tactical brilliance, but his attention kept drifting back to Ethan. The boy had remained silent throughout the confrontation, but his eyes tracked every word with an intelligence that seemed far beyond his years. "There's another option," Alexander heard himself say, the words emerging before his rational mind could stop them. "Ethan could stay with me." The ballroom fell silent, 200 guests processing this unprecedented development. Alexander Sterling, the famously private billionaire bachelor, offering to take in a homeless child. It was the kind of gesture that would dominate tabloid headlines for months. "Alexander," Margaret Ashford whispered urgently, "surely you don't mean—" "I mean exactly what I said," Alexander replied, his voice gaining strength as the decision crystallized in his mind. "My penthouse has 6 bedrooms, a full-time staff, and every resource a gifted child could need to develop his talents. He'd have proper food, medical care, educational opportunities, and access to the finest music teachers in the city." Ms. Morrison looked skeptical. "Mr. Sterling, with all due respect, taking in a traumatized child isn't like adopting a pet. There are psychological considerations, legal requirements, background checks, all of which can be arranged through proper channels," David interjected smoothly. "In the meantime, Mr. Sterling is offering temporary guardianship under direct supervision. Surely that's preferable to institutional placement." Alexander crouched down again, meeting Ethan's eyes with an intensity that seemed to bridge the gap between their vastly different worlds. "What do you think, Ethan? Would you like to stay with me, at least for tonight? You'd have your own room, real food, and we could arrange for proper piano lessons if that's what you want." For the first time since the confrontation began, Ethan spoke, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly in the hushed ballroom. "You really mean it, sir? You'd let me stay, even though I'm just nobody?" The words hit Alexander like a physical blow, their casual self-dismissal revealing depths of pain and insecurity that no 8-year-old should carry. "Ethan, after what I heard tonight, you could never be nobody. You're extraordinary, and anyone who can't see that is blind." He paused, studying the boy's face once more, that nagging sense of familiarity growing stronger with each passing moment. "What did you say your last name was?" "Clark, sir. Ethan Clark." The name hit Alexander with the force of recognition, memories cascading through his consciousness with painful clarity. Emily Clark. The graduate student at Columbia who'd been working on her master's thesis in art therapy when they'd met at a museum gala 9 years ago. Beautiful, brilliant Emily, with her passion for helping troubled children and her laugh that could light up entire rooms. Their relationship had been brief but intense, lasting only a few months before she decided to accept a teaching position in Chicago. They'd parted on good terms, promising to stay in touch, but knowing that their different life paths made a long-distance relationship impractical. He'd thought about her occasionally over the years, wondering how her career had developed, whether she'd found happiness. but he'd never imagined. "Ethan," Alexander said carefully, his heart hammering against his ribs, "tell me about your mother. Do you remember her name?" The boy's face lit up with the first genuine smile Alexander had seen from him all evening. Emily. Her name was Emily, and she was the most beautiful person in the world. She used to sing to me when I was scared, and she smelled like flowers and... His voice trailed off as reality reasserted itself, the happy memory fading back into the harsh present. But she died when I was 4. Car accident. That's when they put me in the home. Now Alexander's vision seemed to narrow to a tunnel, the ballroom and its occupants fading into background noise as the implications crashed over him like a tsunami. Emily Clark. A son named Ethan, who would be exactly 8 years old if he'd been born 9 months after their relationship ended. A child with musical gifts that defied explanation and facial features that were becoming more familiar with each passing second. The mathematics were inescapable, the timeline perfect, and suddenly Alexander understood why he'd felt such an immediate connection to this extraordinary boy. Ethan wasn't just a gifted child who needed help. He was Alexander's son. The revelation hit Alexander with the force of a physical blow, stealing his breath and making his knees weak. 9 years ago, Emily Clark had been the love of his life, even if he'd been too young and ambitious to recognize it at the time. Their brief, passionate relationship had ended when she'd chosen her career over their uncertain future, but he'd never forgotten her laugh, her brilliance, or the way she'd challenged him to be better than he thought possible. And now, staring into Ethan's hazel eyes, eyes that were unmistakably his own, Alexander realized that Emily had taken more than just memories with her to Chicago. "Mr. Sterling?" Miss Morrison's voice seemed to come from a great distance. "Are you all right? You look pale." Alexander forced himself to focus, his mind racing through possibilities and implications, while his heart hammered against his ribs like a caged bird. He couldn't reveal his suspicions here, not in front of 200 witnesses and a social worker who was already skeptical of his motives. But he also couldn't let Ethan disappear into the system now that he understood the truth. "I'm fine," he managed, his voice steadier than he had any right to expect, just moved by the evening's events. Ethan's performance was truly remarkable. David Chen stepped forward, his legal instincts recognizing the shift in his client's demeanor. "Ms. Morrison, I think we can all agree that this situation requires careful consideration rather than hasty action. Perhaps we could arrange for a temporary placement while proper evaluations are conducted." "The department has strict protocols," Ms. Morrison began, but Alexander cut her off with a gesture that commanded absolute attention. "Ms. Morrison, I'm prepared to make a substantial donation to the Department of Children and Family Services, let's say $5 million, to fund improved facilities and programs for children in need. All I ask in return is that Ethan be allowed to stay with me while we work through the legal requirements for proper guardianship." The figure was large enough to make even the jaded social worker pause. $5 million could transform entire programs, help hundreds of children, and probably earn her commendations from every supervisor in the bureaucratic hierarchy. "That's certainly generous, Mr. Sterling, but I can't make decisions based on financial considerations alone." "Of course not," Alexander replied smoothly. "I'm simply demonstrating my commitment to child welfare in general, and Ethan's well-being in particular. David, what would be required for emergency temporary guardianship?" The attorney was already pulling documents from his briefcase, his efficiency suggesting he'd anticipated this development. Background checks, home inspection, character references and court approval. Given your public profile and philanthropic record, I doubt there would be any significant obstacles. The process could be completed within a week. Alexander nodded, but his attention kept drifting to Ethan, who had remained silent throughout the adult negotiations that would determine his fate. The boy's resignation was heartbreaking. Clearly, he'd learned not to hope too much for outcomes beyond his control. "Ethan," Alexander said gently, crouching down once more to meet his eyes. "I know this is confusing and probably scary, but I want you to know that whatever happens, you're going to be taken care of. No more sleeping in doorways, no more going hungry, no more having to survive on your own. Do you understand?" The child nodded mutely, but Alexander could see the disbelief in his expression. Too many adults had made promises they hadn't kept. Too many hopes had been crushed by harsh reality. "Sir," Ethan whispered so quietly that only Alexander could hear, "why are you helping me? I'm grateful, but I don't understand why someone like you would care about someone like me." The question pierced Alexander's heart with its innocent assumption of unworthiness. How could he explain that their connection was deeper than kindness, more fundamental than charity? How could he tell this remarkable child that he might be looking at his father? "Because, Ethan, everyone deserves a chance to develop their gifts and find their place in the world. What you did tonight, the music you created, that was extraordinary. The world needs people who can create beauty in the face of hardship." It was true as far as it went, but it was also incomplete. The whole truth would have to wait until DNA tests could confirm what Alexander's heart already knew with absolute certainty. Miss Morrison cleared her throat impatiently. "Mr. Sterling, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but there are procedures that must be followed. I can't simply hand over custody of a ward of the state to a private citizen, regardless of their resources or reputation." "Then what do you suggest?" Alexander asked, his voice taking on the steely edge that had intimidated senators and Supreme Court justices. "Because I can guarantee you that if this child disappears into the foster system tonight, the story will be front-page news in every major publication by tomorrow morning. Billionaire philanthropist prevented from helping musical prodigy by bureaucratic red tape. How do you think that will play with your supervisors?" The threat was subtle but unmistakable, and Ms. Morrison's expression suggested she understood the implications perfectly. Alexander Sterling had the kind of media connections and political influence that could make or break careers, and her handling of this high-profile case would be scrutinized by everyone from the mayor's office to the governor's mansion. "Perhaps," she said carefully, "we could arrange for supervised temporary placement while the paperwork is processed. You would need to agree to regular visits and compliance with all departmental requirements." "Absolutely," Alexander agreed immediately. "Whatever oversight you deem necessary." David began organizing documents with practiced efficiency. "I can have the initial paperwork filed first thing Monday morning. Background checks, financial verification, home inspection, everything can be completed by end of week." Uday, as the adults negotiated the details of his immediate future, Ethan found his attention drifting back to the magnificent piano that had been the catalyst for this life-changing evening. The Bösendorfer sat silent now, its ebony surface reflecting the chandelier lights like a dark mirror of possibility. "Mr. Sterling." Ethan's voice was hesitant, almost afraid to voice the question that burned in his chest. "If I do get to stay with you, would I be able to play piano? Real piano, I mean, not just the broken one in the subway?" Alexander's smile was the first completely genuine expression he'd worn all evening. "Ethan, I promise you'll have access to the finest instruments and the best teachers money can provide. Your talent deserves every opportunity to flourish." But even as he spoke, Alexander's mind was racing ahead to the DNA test that would either confirm or shatter his growing certainty about Ethan's parentage. The resemblance was becoming more obvious by the minute. The shape of his hands, the way he tilted his head when concentrating, even his mannerisms bore subtle echoes of Alexander's own childhood. "Very well," Miss Morrison said finally, her tone suggesting this deviation from protocol was against her better judgment. "Mr. Sterling, you may take temporary custody of the minor pending completion of proper paperwork and court approval. But I want to be clear. Any violation of our agreement, any sign that the child's welfare is being compromised, and he will be removed immediately." "Understood," Alexander replied. "David, please ensure that all documentation is expedited. I want everything finalized as quickly as possible." As the immediate crisis resolved itself, the ballroom began to return to some semblance of normalcy. Guests who had witnessed the unprecedented drama started to resume their conversations, though Alexander noted that many phones were still recording and social media was undoubtedly exploding with speculation. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying clearly across the space, "I hope you'll join me in celebrating not just tonight's successful fundraising, but also the remarkable young man who reminded us all why music education matters so deeply." The applause that followed was warm and genuine, but Alexander barely heard it. All his attention was focused on Ethan, on the miraculous child who had walked into his life and turned everything upside down in the space of a single evening. As the crowd began to disperse and the evening wound toward its conclusion, Alexander made a mental note to call his private physician first thing in the morning. Dr. Marcus Webb was discreet, efficient, and had handled sensitive medical matters for the Sterling family for over 2 decades. A simple DNA test would provide definitive answers within 48 hours. But deep in his heart, Alexander already knew what those results would show. The timeline was perfect, the resemblance undeniable, and Emily's decision to raise their child alone rather than burden him with unexpected responsibilities was exactly the kind of selfless choice he remembered her making. "Sir?" Ethan's voice interrupted his thoughts. "What happens now? I mean, after tonight?" Alexander knelt down one final time, placing his hands on the boy's narrow shoulders with a gentleness that surprised them both. "Now, Ethan, we figure out how to build a future together. We get you properly fed and rested, we start your formal musical education, and we help you become everything you're meant to be." He paused, studying those hazel eyes that were so heartbreakingly familiar. "And along the way, we might discover that family comes in forms we never expected." The words carried more weight than their surface meaning suggested, and though Ethan couldn't possibly understand their full significance, something in Alexander's tone made him stand a little straighter, hope flickering in his chest like a candle flame protected from the wind. Outside the Meridian Hotel's towering windows, Manhattan glittered with the promise of infinite possibilities, and for the first time in years, Alexander Sterling felt as though he was exactly where he belonged. 3 days later, Alexander sat in his penthouse office overlooking Central Park, staring at the DNA test results that confirmed what his heart had known since the moment Ethan played Debussy. The clinical language couldn't diminish the emotional impact of the simple truth printed in black and white. Ethan Clarke was his son. Dr. Webb had delivered the results personally, his usual professional demeanor softened by understanding. "The paternity probability is 97%, Alexander. There's no doubt that remarkable young man is your biological child." Door. Now, as afternoon sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, Alexander struggled with how to share this revelation with Ethan. The boy had settled into the penthouse with the cautious wonder of someone afraid to believe good fortune might actually last. He'd eaten his first real meals in years, slept in a bed with clean sheets, and spent hours exploring the apartment's music room with its collection of instruments from around the world. "Mr. Alexander?" Ethan's voice came from the doorway, still formal despite 3 days of gentle encouragement to relax. "Mrs. Patterson said you wanted to see me." Mrs. Patterson was the housekeeper who'd taken an immediate protective interest in Ethan, ensuring he was properly fed and clothed while maintaining the kind of maternal warmth that had been absent from his young life for far too long. "Please come in," Alexander said, gesturing to the comfortable chair across from his desk. "And Ethan? You don't need to call me Mr. Alexander anymore. Just Alexander is fine." The boy perched nervously on the edge of the chair, clearly uncertain about this departure from the formal boundaries that had governed their interactions since the gala. His new clothes, jeans and a sweater that actually fit properly, made him look like any other 8-year-old, except for the wariness in his eyes that spoke of too much experience with adult unpredictability. "Am I in trouble?" Ethan asked quietly. "I didn't touch anything I wasn't supposed to, and I've been practicing piano very quietly, just like you said." "Ethan, no," Alexander interrupted gently. "You're not in trouble. You haven't done anything wrong. Actually, I wanted to talk to you about something very important, something that might change everything." He paused, searching for words adequate to the magnitude of what he needed to explain. How did you tell a child that the father he'd never known was sitting right across from him? How did you bridge the gap between abandonment and inheritance, between past pain and future possibility? Do you remember much about your mother? Alexander began carefully. "Beyond what you told me at the hotel?" Ethan's face lit up with the same radiant smile that had appeared whenever Emily's name was mentioned. "She was wonderful. She used to sing lullabies when I couldn't sleep, and she made the best chocolate chip cookies in the world. She always said I was special, that I had gifts that would help people someday." His expression darkened as memory shifted to more painful territory. "Before she died, she got really sick. The cancer made her tired all the time, but she still tried to take care of me. The last thing she said was that my daddy was a good man who would love me if he knew about me, but that she'd decided to protect him from having to choose between his dreams and being a father." The words hit Alexander like a physical blow, revealing the depth of Emily's sacrifice and the weight of responsibility she'd carried alone. She'd known exactly who Ethan's father was, but she'd chosen to spare Alexander the burden of unexpected parenthood at the cost of raising their child in poverty and struggle. "Ethan," Alexander said softly, his voice thick with emotion he no longer tried to hide. "What if I told you that your mother was right? That your father is a good man who would love you very much, and that the only reason he wasn't part of your life was because he never knew you existed?" The boy's eyes widened with a hope so desperate it was painful to witness. Do you know who my father is? Could you help me find him?" Alexander rose from his desk and moved to the window, gathering courage for the revelation that would change both their lives forever. Behind him, Ethan waited with the patience of a child who'd learned not to push too hard for things that seemed too good to be true. "Ethan, 3 days ago I had a DNA test done. Do you know what that is?" Sort of. It's like a blood test that can tell if people are related, right?" "That's right." Alexander turned back to face him, studying those hazel eyes that were mirrors of his own. "The test confirmed something I suspected the moment I heard you play piano at the hotel. Something about your face, your mannerisms, even your musical ability. Everything reminded me of someone I cared about very much a long time ago." He moved closer, kneeling beside Ethan's chair with the same gentle reverence he'd shown at the hotel piano. "Your mother was Emily Clark, and 9 years ago she was the most important person in my world. We were young, and I was focused on building my company, and when she decided to move to Chicago for her career, I let her go because I thought there would be time to figure things out later." Ethan's breathing had become shallow, his small hands gripping the chair arms as the implications of Alexander's words began to sink in. "The DNA test showed that you're my son, Ethan. I'm your father." The silence that followed was profound and complete, broken only by the distant sound of traffic far below and the soft ticking of Alexander's antique clock. Ethan stared at him with an expression that cycled through disbelief, hope, fear, and wonder in rapid succession. "You're my daddy." The words came out as barely a whisper, weighted with years of longing and the terror of having such an impossible dream suddenly offered as reality. "Yes," Alexander said simply. "I'm your father, and I'm so sorry I wasn't there when you needed me. If I had known about you, nothing in the world could have kept me away." Tears began to stream down Ethan's cheeks, but for the first time in memory, they weren't tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of relief, of belonging, of finally understanding where he fit in the world's vast puzzle. Does this mean I get to stay? Forever?" "It means you're home," Alexander replied, his own voice breaking with emotion. "It means you never have to wonder where you belong again, because you belong with me. It means every single day for the rest of your life, you'll wake up knowing that you're loved completely and unconditionally." The dam of Ethan's carefully controlled emotions finally burst, and he launched himself into Alexander's arms with the desperate intensity of a child who'd been holding back years of need. Alexander held him close, feeling the boy's small frame shake with sobs that seemed to carry all the loneliness and fear and uncertainty of his short, difficult life. "I used to dream about this," Ethan whispered against his shoulder. "When I was sleeping in doorways or hiding from the police, I'd imagine what it would be like if my daddy found me and took me home. But I never thought it could really happen." Alexander's own tears fell freely now, his heart breaking for all the nights this extraordinary child had fallen asleep alone and afraid, dreaming of a father who didn't even know he existed. "I'm here now, son. I'm here, and I'm never leaving you again." They stayed that way for long minutes, father and son, finally united after 8 years of separation neither had chosen. When Ethan finally pulled back, his face was red and splotchy from crying, but his eyes held a light that Alexander had never seen before, the light of a child who finally understood that he was wanted and valued and loved. Can I call you Dad?" Ethan asked hesitantly, as if the word might shatter this perfect moment. "Nothing would make me happier," Alexander replied, his smile brighter than Manhattan's entire skyline. Over the following weeks, their relationship deepened with remarkable speed. Ethan's natural intelligence and desperate hunger for connection made him eager to learn everything about his father, while Alexander discovered that parenthood came with an intensity of love he'd never imagined possible. The legal paperwork was expedited with unprecedented efficiency, Alexander's influence and resources ensuring that adoption proceedings moved at lightning speed. Ms. Morrison from Child Services visited regularly, but her initial skepticism had transformed into grudging admiration as she witnessed the obvious bond between father and son. "It's remarkable," she admitted during her final visit. "I've seen a lot of placements in my career, but I've never seen a child adapt this quickly or completely. Ethan has flourished in ways that exceed every metric we use to measure successful outcomes. Indeed, with proper nutrition, medical care, and emotional security, Ethan had begun to resemble the healthy, vibrant 8-year-old he was meant to be. His musical gifts had also exploded into full bloom under the guidance of world-class teachers who marveled at his intuitive understanding of complex compositions. "He doesn't just play the notes," explained Professor Isabella Martinez, the renowned pianist Alexander had hired as Ethan's primary instructor. "He understands the emotional architecture of music in ways that typically take decades to develop. I've never worked with a student who had such natural insight into the connection between technique and feeling." 6 months after that life-changing evening at the Meridian Hotel, Alexander stood in the wings of Carnegie Hall, watching his son perform with the New York Youth Symphony in his first professional concert. Ethan wore a perfectly tailored tuxedo that made him look like a miniature version of his father, his posture confident and his expression serene as he prepared to play Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. "Nervous?" Alexander asked quietly. "No, Dad," Ethan replied with a smile that held all the confidence of a child who'd found his place in the world. "I know exactly where I belong now." As the first notes of the concerto filled the historic hall, Alexander felt tears of pride and gratitude streaming down his face. The music Ethan created was transcendent, speaking of journey and struggle and ultimate triumph over circumstances that had once seemed insurmountable. In the audience, Margaret Ashford dabbed at her eyes with a silk handkerchief, while Dr. Wells shook his head in wonder at the transformation he'd witnessed. Even the usually stoic Mrs. Patterson was openly weeping with maternal pride. But for Alexander, the greatest miracle wasn't his son's extraordinary talent or his remarkable recovery from trauma. The greatest miracle was simpler and more profound. A family had been created from the ashes of loss and separation. Two hearts had found their way to each other across impossible odds, and love had proven once again that it could transform even the most broken circumstances into something beautiful. As the final notes of the concerto soared toward Carnegie Hall's gilded ceiling, father and son shared a moment of perfect understanding. They had both found their way home at last, and their journey together was just beginning. The standing ovation that followed seemed to last forever, but Alexander knew that the real applause would echo in their hearts for the rest of their lives. They had discovered that family wasn't just about blood or DNA tests or legal documents. It was about the choice to love unconditionally, to believe in each other's potential, and to create beauty together in a world that desperately needed it. Ethan had taught Alexander that success meant nothing without someone to share it with, while Alexander had shown Ethan that dreams could come true even when they seemed impossible. Together, they had created a symphony more beautiful than any music ever written, the harmony of a father and son who had found each other against all odds and chosen to build a future filled with love, music, and infinite possibility.